Hello, my name's John O'Leary. I'm a partner in Mason Hayes & Kern. I've been asked to moderate this panel discussion on, as was said, disruptive technologies and their roles in the evolution of litigation finance. I had a call yesterday with the rest of the panel here, and I have to say I was a little bit surprised as to being moderator on this topic, being from Ireland, in circumstances where litigation funding is actually prohibited. Nonetheless, I'm very happy to do it. We have a really strong panel here today who I'll now introduce. I'll ask them just to give a little bit of their background and their involvement in litigation financing. Firstly, we have Nick Rose Davis, who is CEO of Chancery Finance. So Nick, if you just want to give it
Sure. Thanks, John. So I was a litigation lawyer for about 22 years, and then saw the light and moved over to the dark side, as it were, if that makes sense. Became a litigation funder, founding an organisation called Van Capital, which is still going. And then ran Burford Capital, which is the world's largest litigation funder. I was responsible for everything outside the Americas for several years. And 2 years ago, I left there to form Chancery Capital, which is a litigation funder. And so I've been working in this industry for about 10 years now, and pretty much developed what I would refer to as portfolio funding, which is a slightly different basis of litigation finance, where instead of funding single cases, you fund a set of cases which allows you to work directly with corporate clients and fund both small, large and defence cases. So a slightly different approach.
Perfect. Ben Knowles is a partner and a co-chair of the International Arbitration Group in Clyde & Co.
Hello everybody, I'm not sure, it's not the most wonderful place to sit, but anyway, that's me. So I've been at, for my sins, I've been at Clyde & Co for 25 years, and I've been co-chairing the arbitration group for a number of years, and I have worked with Mr. Rolls Davis and a number of his colleagues and competitors in relation to the litigation funding and arbitration and disputes funding market. And we have seen some really rapid change and evolution in that market in recent years, and I think the pace of change is accelerating, and hopefully we'll get a chance in this session just to explain to you from a user's perspective some of the opportunities that we see and some of the ways in which people are doing stuff.
William Evans is CEO of Alexa Capital and Advisors, and is involved in Litigation 1 with Sam Watson here.
Good afternoon. I practiced as a solicitor and a barrister for about 40 years, and got involved with Nick quite a few years ago. But I was also involved in founding Van Capital with him about 8 years ago, and I'm also involved in Chancery with him. But Alexa Capital is a new litigation funder, just getting going, of which I am the CEO, and also involved in Sam's venture, which he'll tell you about.
And finally, Sam Watson is our final speaker, and he is CEO of Litigation 1. So Sam is just going to introduce himself and then just give a short overview of his new business. Yeah.
Great, thank you, John, for having to stretch with the mic. I don't quite have as much experience as my learned friends here, but I'm the founder of an investment advisory company called Van Capital. We specialize in innovative finance and new technologies, such as blockchain, of course, as the Confident Technology Conference. I'm also the founder of Litigation 1, which is Europe's only two-sided crowdfunding platform focused on commercial litigation. We focus on secondary market opportunities to help solve one of the main issues that funders face, which is secondary market liquidity. We can talk a bit more about that later, I guess. But
Good.
Thanks.
Okay, Sam is going to just go through a few slides.
Sure.
relating to his company. Yeah.
Great, I'm gonna have to keep looking back.
Do you have a
I go quick, great. So like I said, Litigation One is a UK-based crowdfunding platform for, so people can see, focused on secondary market opportunities in litigation finance space. So we work with a number of litigation funders around the world, and we're about to launch the platform in September. We've been working on it for 6 months or so. Okay, I'm mic'd up to the brim. We're the first platform that's really trying to bridge the gap between retail capital and the litigation finance space. And we really need a platform to do so. I mean, you saw, I read a Financial Times article last year which said £10 billion was raised by UK funders for commercial litigation purposes. I'm not sure how accurate that number is, but I suppose the trajectory of the industry is like this. And there is no representation for retail money at the moment. I mean, the only way for retail guys to get into the space is through investing in the likes of Burford. Excuse me for looking back constantly. So I think some of the main problems that we see funders facing are obviously raising capital. There's a lot of funders out there with plenty of deal flow, but very limited access to capital, the means to raise it. So we're a platform for funders to essentially raise capital for interesting deals. Once again, focused on secondaries, but also open to primary. Deploying capital. There's a lot of funders out there, or funds with money, who cannot get access to quality litigation investment opportunities. So we're building a marketplace for funders, only premier funders, to list and offer such opportunities. Lack of automation, that's really a problem through both the legal and litigation finance industry. At the moment, it's a very bespoke place with quite analog systems, and I think you see a lot of visionary ideas, but very few people actually implementing technology into their business models. You've seen the likes of LexShares in the States having a lot of success, and we can talk about them more later as well, but they have an amazing technology called the Diamond Mine, which allows them to, they basically built a natural language processing system to read through case data and then pick cases which match certain criteria to basically build their origination and their pipeline. So that's one of the leading businesses in the technology and innovation space in litigation finance. And then, obviously, as I mentioned before, secondary market liquidity, getting out of investments which you can be locked into for multiple years, is also an issue for funders that we're trying to solve. Right, so for retail investors, there's very few options of getting in. You could buy shares in Burford, that's probably still a good idea. And then LexShares, as I mentioned before, is a good way, but really for the retail punters, what they I think are looking for is a commoditized type of product, which is insured, lower yield, perhaps spread across a wide basket of litigation. So we're focusing on portfolios, I suppose, rather than single case investments. I just wanted to bring up this case study the other day.
Who was that guy?
He was that, I don't recognize him, but I thought this was a great deal for the guy who bought it. 77 million. They were expected to sell it for, it was expected to return 101 million pounds, but they sold it for 77 million. And that was estimated to be 12 months before it was coming to fruition. So I thought, wow, it's a massive discount. But if you look at Burford's IRR, and this isn't uncommon in the space, I think it's 30-something percent, 31%. So if you discount that back, then yeah, they actually did quite a good deal. So the calculation I did here was pretty simple, basically saying there's a 6% chance based on statistics that they only returned 5 million from this investment. So a 94% chance that they got 101, it might be more, might be less. But then if you discount the value of that, 95.24 back, you get less than 77. So that just shows you the opportunity for secondary markets and secondary market sales from funders and how much they're looking to get into the space. So a little bit about Litigation One. We are trying to automate as much as possible. A lot of that is through the actual funding process, contracting process, and onboarding of clients, KYB, KYC. Right, so the blockchain side of things. We're trying to integrate a new form of smart contract into our platform, which is essentially creating an automated funding agreement between offerer of an opportunity and the funder, so investors. And that allows us to fractionalize the investment across many, many investors. Now, the issue with smart contracts currently is that, well, actually I'll go forward a slide, they look like this. That looks like Chinese to me. I don't read code, but maybe some of you do. What the system we're looking at developing in partnership with a company called Lexon, which I'm also a co-founder of, is trying to make that look like this. And the amazing thing about this, once it eventually happens, is that lawyers can then program smart contracts, which allows huge access to the space, to blockchain, to crowdfunding using smart contract technology. So that's a really innovative thing I've been quite close to and keen to push along. Now, liquidity is also another issue in the space, and what we're looking to do at Litigation One is create an alternative trading system, so people who invest in opportunities on our platform can trade them within our marketplace, like a private liquidity venue for litigation finance. I think that's quite important. So once again, Lex shares. So they actually originate about 80% of the cases that they fund through the Diamond Line, through this AI system they've built, and 20% through people actually recommending cases or listing of cases. So that's had huge success already. But there's a lot of other companies out there trying to, bring automation to the legal space, to the litigation space. This is just one of them. I'm not sure how much of this is actually going to go through or not, but there's a lot of ideas basically. And I think one of the main issues is adoption rather than new ideas or groundbreaking sort of technology. Okay, I think today we're going to talk about AI a little bit as well. So machine learning is quite a simple process. I think it sounds more complicated. It sounds more complicated than it is, and that's unfortunate because really what it is it involves a lot of data. And Ben Knowles has a lot of data, so we can dive into what Clyde and Co are doing after this. But you take case data, for example, and you feed it into a machine, an algorithm, and you train that algorithm to say, okay, when we have these types of case documents or these situations based on jurisdiction, funding agreement, type of claim, whatever it is, you can predict, and you train the machine to say, okay, that's the input, this is the output. You need a lot of that data, both input and output data, to then take the machine to the next stage where you say, okay, here's a new case, here's the data, generate us an output and predict what's going to happen in this case. So that's, for funding, I think that's a really useful use of AI. There's also AI and technology like this that can be used for the actual, legal firm side of things rather than the litigation side of things. Maybe we should talk about that in a minute. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Sam. Obviously the topic today is disruptive technologies and their role in the evolution of litigation finance, which is the subject of many articles which say that technologies are available now to predict or indicate the likely outcome of cases. And I suppose I might just open it to the panel to get their view as to whether this is actually the case and where they see the future of technology, I suppose, assisting with litigation financing.
Can I chip in, John, at that point?
Yeah.
So at Clyde's, there's two things that I've been particularly involved in the last few years in relation to the technological side of it. The first is in relation to the use of AI and the prediction of the outcome of cases. And the second is in relation to a project we've got called Clyde Code, which is to do with the drafting of smart contracts for various of our clients. But if I can just talk about the AI side first. We ran a project last year with UCL because what we wanted to do, we had seen projects that had been run in the States around prediction of outcomes of cases, and what was being done was fairly narrow. It was IP cases in particular courts, and I think that the thesis behind it was to try and identify whether one might stand a better chance of success before a particular judge in a particular jurisdiction for a particular type of case. But it was actually quite once you delved down into it, it was quite a limited area in which they were looking at, and the cases were relatively similar, so they were looking at a limited number of facts. I operate in the arbitration sphere. We have a vast variety of cases. No two cases are the same. A lot of you will do similar sort of work to the work that I do, and we wanted to see, well, what would be the value of actually looking at analysing some of this material to see if we could get some indications about outcomes and see what else would come out of the project. And I think what was interesting for us is that the first lesson that we had was when UCL came in to talk to us. They started talking to us about our data, and being old-fashioned lawyers, we said, well, look, there's the files on my desk, and there's some over there, and there's a big heap of paper on the floor. But actually, one of the things that was interesting is we started to look behind some of the material that we do have, and that we realised that without even having, if you like, we didn't at that stage have a real policy around data and how we would mine data in the future. But we had quite a lot of information in our business inception programs, in our costs and time recording programs, and so what we were able to do was to have a look at some of that data and mine some of that data and see what we had. And I'll give you a sort of a fairly kind of silly example, but it was something that really got my mind going, which was, as lawyers, we tend to operate in isolation, and when you become a sort of fairly senior lawyer in a firm, a lot of the advice you give is given on the basis of experience plus gut instinct. Somebody asks you, how long do you think this case will run? You say, I think it's going to be about 18 months. You think, well, why? If you then analyse that and think, well, how did I reach that decision? The reality is what you've done is delved into your own data that you're holding in your brain, done a sort of quick and dirty assessment of that, and come out with a figure which you think seems reasonable and which might be acceptable to a client. Actually, when we then started to look at some of the data that we did hold from our matter inception systems and from our cost systems and the like, what we realised is that there was a big disconnect between some of the advice that we were giving off the cuff and actually the information that we had available. And we also realised how much data we do have available. So one of the big learning points to come out of that project was to think about, okay, well, if we're going to make money out of this data that we've got in the future, we need to start to have data policies, and we need to have much more consistency about how we record data. Silly points like making sure files get closed on time, because if you've got a file that is opened at the start of the case and is closed promptly at the end of the case, apart from the fact that that's complying with SRA regulations and all the rest of it, it does actually give you some quite accurate data about how long a case takes, and not just the hearing itself, but all the stuff that happens afterwards and enforcement and all of those sorts of issues. So I think one of the big learning points to come out of it was that we as law firms have a lot of data, but most of us don't exploit it most of the time. There are sort of exceptions to that in particular areas. Certain parts of the insurance sector have done a lot of work in this area, and Bill was telling me about some projects that he'd done, I think before I'd even left university. So people have been doing some of this, but I think it's an area that is worthy of looking at again. And I think the other thing was to think about some of the factors that we look at when advising on cases and prospects of success. So you tend to look at the merits and you look at some fairly obvious points, but some of the things that perhaps we don't always think about is some of the factors behind the scenes that might be impacting on the outcome. Not just you have things like this in arbitration, the seat of the arbitration. You might have issues like whether you've got 3 arbitrators or 1 arbitrator, but you might have some more interesting ones. Where is the client from? Where is their company based? Is it an individual? Is it a corporation? Is it a public corporation? Is it a private company? And the same with the enforcement on the other side. So I think the other big learning point we took from that was that we all possess actually quite a lot of information about factors that we don't regularly think about. And one of the things that's caused us to do is now to record better some of this information so that we can try and identify some of the, give ourselves, if you like, a bit of a competitive edge and identify some of the other factors that we might not have thought about. Again, a sort of obvious one in arbitration is about the appointment of arbitrators. one of the sort of value adds, if you like, that a lot of big law firms have had is that they have worked with a number of arbitrators over a number of years, and if you have the opportunity to appoint arbitrators, then you can, if you like, mine the internal database about who's done what with whom and what sort of outcomes. But really, that's all been done at a very informal level. You know, someone sends an email around or a quick couple of calls to some likely characters. You know, what do you think of so and so? I can't stand him. You know, or I think so and so is terrific. But often, what you don't do is to sort of delve behind that. Well, why can't you stand him? Well, somebody lost a case which they should always have lost, but nonetheless, they didn't like the fact that happened. So one of the things, another thing we're looking at is trying to get a bit more information, subject always, of course, to GDPR and all those sorts of things we have to deal with, to assess some of those sort of factors, and again to try and look in a bit more detail about how those factors might impact on the outcome of cases. I'll leave that bit there, but I'd like to come back at some point about the sort of smart contract piece as well, because I think that plays in a bit later into the discussion.
Okay, so I suppose, Nick, would you have any view how technology has played a role recently in the litigation funding market?
Yeah, I think it's played a role in a number of different ways, whether it be machine learning and artificial intelligence, or using the data that's available publicly to enhance the decision-making process, or, for example, as Sam mentioned earlier, LexShare's approach with their diamond mine, and I'll perhaps start with that, because that's the other thing that I think you have to draw a distinction between is what goes on in the US market compared to here, simply because of the way that their systems operate, in that all of their court documents are online and available publicly once they're filed, once the case is issued, and most of their litigation is dealt with by a docketed judge, which means that the judge retains the case throughout the process, as opposed to here, where that isn't necessarily the case, and therefore what I'll come on to being the assessment of what decision that a judge is likely to make is not going to help you necessarily here if you have a different judge, or get a different judge in the commercial court on the day of trial from that which you've already assessed. It's not much use to you. So the diamond mine process that LexShares use, who are a competitor to us but in a very different space, they analyse all of the data that's available publicly by some fairly sophisticated search software, which allows them to decide if they want to look for, or they're targeting, specific sorts of cases, whether they be particular range of value IP cases issued in Texas, or whether they're a particular breach of contract case issued in the Southern District of New York. Their search software allows them to scour all the various different formats of how these pieces of information are held publicly on the internet by the court system, allows them to then produce a result of 15 different cases that are within the range of 50 to 100 million issued by White & Case in the Southern District of New York in the last 6 months, which gives them then the contact details, and they have a band of 7 telesales people who will then use that information and call the lawyers and try and offer them money. Now, I didn't realise that 80% of their actual origination comes from that process, but that's pretty impressive. That allows them to gain market access across the whole of the US using a very small team and not having to travel very far in order to do it. Now that's one method of using technology to enhance your litigation finance process, but I suspect the thing that most people want to think about, or certainly from a funder's perspective, is that of risk assessment. How can you use the data that's available, whether that we know about or that has been collated or is in Ben's head, and then needs to be extracted for the purposes of deciding whether this is a good, bad or indifferent case, or good, bad or indifferent investment, and the two things are not necessarily, of course, the same. So there have been a number of attempts to look at outcomes based on the information you have at the start of the case, and of course litigation finance might be something which you consider at various different stages of the proceedings, either pre-proceedings or even post-trial awaiting judgment, and depending on when it is that you are making that assessment, and clearly you have different sets of information available, some better than others. But there are two that I know of applications that are currently being used. One is Ravel Law and one is Premonition in the States, where they claim to be able to use the information that is publicly available on decisions made by judges in particular cases with differing lawyers in front of them in different courts, The other one also tracks the performance of certain lawyers in certain courts. The concerning thing is that, given that in a trial you've got a 50-50 outcome, premonition has a 30.2% success rate, which seems not terribly helpful in the litigation finance space. So I think probably there's some work to be done, but you can see the road that these people are going down. Settlement Analytics is another organisation that's probably a bit more prominent, that seems to be able to take the data that you have and analyse it and produce potential outcomes. I think what I'm saying is, anything that can give you an edge in assessing and analysing the information that is out there and is available is going to be used by a litigation funder in trying to enhance their risk assessment process. It's very difficult to automate that, but what you can do is make the job a little easier by automating the filtering process and taking out those cases which don't match the specific criteria, the firms that you wouldn't necessarily want to work with, the budget ratios to damages, and that leaves you with a lot less to do. So I think it will get there. I'm not saying it won't ever happen, and I think we will start to see better results from the likes of Premonition and Revell Law and others in that space, or hopefully, or they won't be around for very long. But it's going to take a little bit of time. But I think the message from us is anything that can assist in that process, we're going to try and look at.
Obviously, in the US model that you discussed there, they have the benefit of the PACER system, which has all the pleadings filed throughout the country. And on our call yesterday, it was discussed that there has been talk over the last number of years of introducing something similar over here, or certainly moving towards that, which would obviously assist in terms of the litigation financing space. Where are we here in the context of England anyway?
Well, I can answer that one. I sit as a recorder, a part-time judge, and I get periodical emails from the Lord Chief Justice telling me how the transformation of the English courts is going, and they're all very hopeful. It's all going to be digitised, and it's all going to work wonderfully at some point in the future. What happens when I go to court and see what's actually there and the way it's done, of course, is something entirely different. So the answer is it will be digitised. They're already setting up the same sort of things as the PACER system with courts, so that pleading, cases have to be issued electronically, pleadings have to be filed electronically, and so on. And eventually that will be, because those are publicly available documents now, you just have to go to court and look at the bits of paper. Those will be available online, but it will come in a few years, it won't work, it will be fixed, and it will be quite a long time, I think, basically.
Can I was listening to a podcast this morning about the court system here, and a funny quote was, "Courts using yesterday's technology tomorrow."
Yes, well, there's a lot of that. But to also pick up on what Nick has just been saying, there's quite a lot of effort, active effort in automating relatively straightforward data for relatively process-driven purposes. Like Sam was talking about in terms of acquiring clients and so on, and there's lots of work on contracts, but at the moment, relatively simple, straightforward contracts. And you can see that automation for those sorts of things is likely to be very successful, and with language processing now possible, computers can read documents. And certainly lots of document management work is done by computer. But there's still issues even with that, in the sense that if the computer's reading the words on a document and looking for the smoking gun, the person who's writing the email, which is the smoking gun, quite often changes their style, changes the language, uses slightly hidden language, and computers still have to get a bit more sophisticated to do that. Nonetheless, the research shows that actually they're much more accurate than people doing it. So that's all obviously possible. And there's the stuff in the States where they look at what a judge is doing, what a lawyer's doing, how successful are they, and so on, which, as John says, is difficult to replicate in this country, although for arbitrators could be quite useful. But in terms of the litigation decisions made at the moment by human beings, that is a very big step from that sort of electronic activity. Because if you look at it, when one is looking at a case, you might have several causes of action, you have relatively, possibly completely unique factual situations, you have lots of places where there might be evidence, you have different sorts of evidence, oral evidence, documentary evidence, and so on, and you may have several different scenarios. You have all the difficulties about working out what's likely to happen on quantum, and so on. And all of those things require a deep understanding of the interface of all of those things. Now, obviously, machine learning eventually ought to be able to do it, but we're talking about quite a long time. But that doesn't mean that you can't use it for helping risk assessments, and I'm particularly very interested in looking at how you can not so much standardise, but make more consistent risk decisions, particularly for funding, and particularly if you're offering packages of funding on a platform like Litigation One. You need to be able to show people that the risk scores that are given to different types of, or different portfolios or cases, whatever they are consistently allocated. And it seems to me that driving the risk assessment process, using humans, but driving it by using computer algorithms and so on, I think is certainly going to be an intermediate stage between where we are now and much more sophisticated, the computer actually making the decisions. And of course, for litigation funding, you're not just looking at will the case win or lose. You're looking at the risks inherent in the law firm, the client, the type of evidence, the recovery risk, and all. There's so many different aspects to the risk that we have to assess.
Ben, earlier you touched upon litigation funding in the context of arbitrations. Has the use of technology assisted in that sphere, or obviously it's, as we said, it's probably easier to carry out an assessment of the various parties on the information in such a scenario. Perhaps you...
Well, just picking up, actually, I'm going to slightly cheat and pick up on a point that Bill was making just a second ago, and I'll come back to you on that. I think in the broader arbitration space and in relation to the relationship of the UK with the EU and such thorny issues as that, one of the big, and NAFTA and some of the global trade issues that Donald Trump is so keen on, one of the big issues has been around this concept of secret justice, aka arbitration. And one of the interesting things to come out of all of that, and there's an interesting misconception, because of course ICSID arbitration, which is one of the main forums for trade arbitration and investor-state arbitration anyway, is all public, and it's all of the information is out there and published, so quite why people call it secret justice, I don't know. But there is a move in arbitration to publish much more information which will be available for the data mining processes. So you've now got the ICC publishes a lot of anonymised information, The LTIA here does it sometimes. Some of the trade arbitration bodies do it. LMA has done it for a long time. So I think there is going to be a push towards more and more information going out into the public domain. It's interesting with the when it's done on a sort of lightweight, anonymised basis, because I think that if you don't know, for example, who the parties are and whether they were well funded or not, often you can't really understand the outcome of the case. If you've got you might look at a case, but if you don't know it's Exxon against somebody else, I mean, the odds are that Exxon's going to have done a pretty good job in getting themselves to a hearing and will have deployed all the resources that might be sorry, I hope no one's here from Exxon, but they will have deployed all of the muscle that they've got. They will have been able to fund a case and what have you. Whereas if you had for example, an individual as a claimant, they might be in a position where they didn't have access to a whole load of the sorts of things that a big corporate would have. So I think sometimes it's a bit dangerous with this publication analysis of some of the data from arbitration, because some of the key facts, which actually are major factors, are just not publicly available. Often they are available if you phone a friend, but they're not necessarily publicly available. So I think there will be more information on an ongoing basis that is available to be analysed. In terms of what's actually happening in the arbitration process, there is much more now being done around the whole kind of litigation support piece and analysis being fed into the disclosure process and the disclosure analysis and all of that. I think there's still quite some way to go before some of this becomes really useful to lawyers. And I think part of that's around the way in which we operate, because with a few exceptions, we're not very process orientated. There are particular parts of the legal sector that are very process orientated. But if you want to use the sorts of tools that we're talking about, you've got to adopt fairly standard processes for the way in which you do a lot of your work, so that you can then compare, you can look for inconsistencies. If everybody does everything in a completely different way, starting from scratch, it's very, very difficult to analyse some of the material available.
Sam, you spoke earlier, or you touched on earlier about blockchain in the context of litigation finance. Do any of the other panellists have a view on how that may or may not assist?
Well, for contracts in particular, but I suppose for the sort of platform that Litigation One is, it might develop into using virtual currencies as well.
We should probably not dive too deep into the whole technology side of blockchain. I don't want to bore everybody here, but I think the smart contract is the most powerful application of blockchain technology we've seen to date. Ethereum has shown that. Over $14 billion of fundraising has been raised over Ethereum in an ERC20 contract, which is essentially just a token. That's all a smart contract is in that instance. Now, whether that could be used for litigation finance, I don't know. I'd hope so, because the benefit of that is you can issue that smart contract over the internet to anyone in the world very cost effectively. So you can essentially fundraise a bucket of claims or an individual claim through a global network of investors, which is pretty cool. In terms of actual distributed ledger technology, you'll see a lot of adoption from law firms, I think, who need to keep data in a stored, secure database, perhaps encrypted, perhaps not, where it's transparent, open, and everyone can access it within the firm, or perhaps even court documents perhaps could be on the blockchain. So there's so many applications, but it's all very theoretical at the moment.
I think, as we were talking about before, one of the possibilities may well be the use of actually using the changing the funding contract itself, so that you could, if you use blockchain technology for the funding contract itself, then one might be able to build in the milestones for the drawdowns, for example, on the monthly payments or the payments that are made when particular phases of the case are reached, which would give more certainty for everybody involved as to when payments were due and whether they've been collected and what information had been put in order to collect. But I think that the interesting part of that is not so much the process itself, but the audit trail that's then created. So that if 6 months further down the line there's then a row about whether or not there should have been a particular drawdown at a particular time for a particular reason, there will be a ledger as to exactly what has happened, exactly what was said in order to trigger that, and it should be relatively easy for somebody to work out should that drawdown have been made and shouldn't have been made, and to sort the problem.
That's a good point. I think the main benefits of blockchain and this technology is transparency, trust. It works well in a high-value, low-trust system. So perhaps it could be paying your lawyers or billable hours from the law firm, and then distribution of a funding contract perhaps as well.
I think it certainly takes away if the conditionality in the contract is met, it means the payment's automated, it automatically happens. That would take away any concern that a funder wouldn't pay when they're supposed to pay, or at the other end, if you're using a number of different investors, that the distribution of the funds at the back end is done properly and accurately and subject to conditions. I wonder if it might be useful for us to talk briefly about the difference between primary and secondary litigation finance, because I'm not sure that, I'm assuming that everybody knows what litigation funding is, but when we talk about secondary markets and all that sort of stuff, it might be a good idea for just to explain why what you're doing is useful to people like me and in the funding market, because it's not immediately obvious to the legal profession at large, and perhaps not this audience. Litigation funding in its most basic form, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is where external capital pays the legal bills for somebody who either can't or doesn't want to make those payments. And I don't mean every client, obviously. They have to have a meritorious claim, which we, as a funder, think is going to win or settle with an appropriate amount of recovery, with not a massive collection risk, which means that we get a return on our investment and they get enough to stay interested throughout the process to make sure they stay involved. Because clearly, if we took too much, they wouldn't remain involved, and we're a little handicapped in driving that to a resolution. Now, that's basic single case funding. Portfolio funding is where you fund a basket or a range of cases, but from a funder's perspective, it's more of an attractive option because your risk of capital loss is much lower, because if you don't get the money back on the first case, hopefully you get it on the second or the third, and if you get to number 5, you probably shouldn't be a litigation funder, so you should be doing something else, or a lawyer, in fact. The difference between portfolio funding and traditional single case funding. Single case funding has a binary outcome, win or lose. Even if you win, you might not get enough money. Dangerous, expensive. Nobody in their right mind would use it, frankly, unless you are an insolvent or distressed purchaser. That won't win me any friends in my industry, but I genuinely think that's right. The pricing's too expensive. Commercial clients would find it very difficult to justify paying 300 or 400% on the money, unless they really have no interest in litigation, in which case that's a different ballgame. In a distressed situation, you might not have a choice. To make our products more attractive for corporate clients, we have to reduce the price, which means we have to reduce the risk, because that's how we price what we do. And in order to reduce the risk, we want to spread it across a number of cases, which means our risk of capital loss is lower, and that means we can provide investment in cases or a range of cases to corporate clients at a price which they're prepared to justify to their board or their shareholders, so maybe 15, 20, 25% per annum. Still expensive, probably cheaper than putting it on your credit card, but it's non-recourse, you don't have to pay it back. Now, the other thing about portfolios is, which is still primary litigation finance, is you can fund different sorts of cases, small, large, defence, and that makes it a much more interesting product for corporate clients and makes it more accessible to most litigants if you have a range of cases. Funders, one of the funders' biggest problems is when you get the investment from your investors and you invest it in cases, the duration of those investments tends to be reasonably long, because litigation and arbitration can take 18 months to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years in some sort of bilateral investment treaty situations. That means that you need to have a big return to pay back over that long, when they've had to wait for it over a long period of time to make sure they're getting the right value for their investment. What a secondary market does is allows you to get out as a funder of the original investment by laying off firstly some of the risk, which means somebody else takes part of the risk, but it also allows you to book a profit if you manage to sell your part or all of your investment at a profit, and allows you liquidity, firstly to book a profit so it looks like you're a successful funder, which is always useful, and secondly, you can give money back to your investors more quickly. So what Sam's business is doing is creating a platform where there are a number of different ways that you can become involved as a retailer or an institutional investor in litigation finance. And you can invest in cases where a funder is partway through but doesn't want to pay the whole budget, they want to get out, where they might want to book a profit by selling part of the investment, where they don't have enough money because they've got a liquidity issue, and the budget is going up because the lawyers are spending too much money. I know that's a real surprise. Never happens. And they need further investment. Or a funder that has a book of 20, 30, 100 cases but wants to get some cash in to do something else can sell a slice to the platform's investors who will get a lower risk investment, which means they'll get a lower return, but the liquidity is given back to the funder. So all of a sudden you've created a platform, an exchange if you will, where a funder can raise money almost at will, sell part of their investment, and it's not been done before, which is why it's so exciting, but it's being done on blockchain technology, which adds another level of security and fidelity to what's going on. So I hope that very small primer explains the difference between where funding started with single case binary outcomes to where Sam's taking the industry in terms of a secondary market platform to allow almost crowdfunding, and anybody that wants to invest in this space, subject to the right accreditations and qualifications of whatever you need to do, allows them to invest in any form of litigation finance. Is that a fair?
You should be doing my investor meetings.
We can talk.
It's a very good overview.
Okay, good. There you go.
I
Sorry.
think the whole purpose of why we're investing in technology is really to bring down the cost of funding. I mean, that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing. And on the back of that, it's also to improve access to justice for the claimant. Because the lower the cost of funding, the lower the cost of going to pursue justice for the claimant is. I think that's really the big picture.
Just to chip in, there's a sort of, there may be an interesting byproduct here in relation to the to the law firm perspective, and having been involved in management and law firm for quite a long time, I've got some experience of this, and that is that as a law firm, from time to time, you look at what the market is doing, and all law firms are particularly strong in one sector and not so strong in another sector, and will have a regional reach that's good here and not so good here, and all the rest of it. And one of the ideas that we've been messing around with is that historically, if you wanted, if you like, to hedge your position, generally speaking, what that meant was you had to merge with another law firm, or you had to laterally recruit some partners in a different jurisdiction, in a different sector. I think one of the interesting things about this is that if you're for example, a successful UK corporate law firm, and you look at the state of the market and you think, you know what, I don't think the next 2 or 3 years are going to be wonderful for us here, but I like the look of arbitration in Paris over the next 3 years because that seems to be a boom area, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Well, historically, what you've got to do is go and recruit some partners, and that may or may not work for you. One of the things the secondary market might allow you to do is to actually invest in cases that are being run in a particular sector, in a particular region, in a particular jurisdiction, if you like to hedge and to sort of balance the exposure of your practice. I'm absolutely certain that some people will do this. There will definitely be some firms where the partnership just won't get there in terms of the idea behind it, but I'm sure there are going to be some innovators who are going to look at this and say, actually, that's a very nice way of, if you like, smoothing the returns.
That's a very good point.
Sorry, I was actually just going to open up to the floor for any questions for the panel. I think we have one here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask how the corporate world is reacting to the secondary market proposal.
Well, I think you can see they want it. We're laying very quiet at the moment. So we're going to launch in September. So really, you are the first people who probably hear about this platform. But I think it's going to make a lot of noise. And it's going to be a very, very useful tool for funders to offload some risk and for investors to get into the space.
I think the other thing that's interesting is Jeffrey's well-known outfit now have a full-time secondary market litigation finance desk that all it does is place these deals. They did the Peterson deal for Burford. To be fair, the guys running it used to work for me at Burford, so they're both well trained in litigation finance, but that's all they do at Jeffrey's. JP Morgan have been looking at it. I know Morgan Stanley have also taken steps into the same space. So I think if you come back in 12 months' time, I suspect the speed at which this asset class is growing, it wouldn't surprise me to have 4 or 5 specific outfits doing this. But the benefit for them is that they get access to a much wider range if they use something like Litigation One, or it wouldn't surprise me if Sam had 4 or 5 competitors in a few years' time because of the way it's going. So I think the reaction's been good from the commercial world.
Do you guys think that will lead to a kind of, whatever you want to call it, traded market in investment
Yeah,
into those products?
I think it will.
That's crazy. No, it's like a commodity trading.
It's exactly
That's
what
what
it
we'd
is.
like to do. We'd like to commoditize
And
litigation
but
finance.
that's big.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it has already been going on. There've been people wrapping up bunches of cases and selling them for 5 or 10 years, just not in volume and not in the main market.
Yeah, but if
And-
that platform is going to work, and then you can
Right.
kind of access it as a consumer,
Yeah,
and is it going to be traded market price for investment into a specific region?
That's stage 2. Yeah, so if we're going to essentially list buckets of opportunities that we've bundled together on the platform, hopefully with the assistance of AI, we'll have sophisticated professional, maybe even institutional investors buy into those buckets, as well as an ISA product here in the UK, which is essentially a tax-free investment for retail consumer investors. So we'll have that option going into these buckets too. But the secondary phase will be the alternative trading system I mentioned before, which will really be a daily liquidity venue for people who want to trade in those positions. So you'll say, okay, Australia bucket and IP bucket over here, we can swap over and trade in and out of those.
But then coming back to just bringing it back to some of you who may be not in private practice but in-house, Sam made the important point, and Nick as well, that the idea about this is to bring the cost of the litigation funding down. The next stage of that is that there are more and more clients looking at larger arrangements with law firms, whether it's, you could call it outsourcing, you could call it partnership, you could call it those sorts of arrangements. If you can bring in litigation funding to those sorts of arrangements, it can help you to create a much more, if you like, financially efficient arrangement, JV, whatever you want to call it, with clients, particularly those that have large portfolios for whom claims are part of their business, the commodities sector, the marine sector, trading, banks, those sorts of entities. And we're already seeing that. That's already happened in the States, and I'm sure it will happen over here as well.
What's the legality of those kind of litigation fund? It is legal in any market?
Which part of it?
litigation funding.
Is litigation funding legal?
Yeah.
Not in Ireland.
Or India.
Or
Or Middle East?
Probably a question better asked.
Yeah, there are still a number of jurisdictions, not many, but where litigation finance is a challenge. Historic rules on maintenance and champity and interference in other people's litigation, particularly in Ireland, seems to be a statutory issue, and recently decisions there have shown that that remains the case. Australia, by way of example, has pretty much abandoned maintenance and champity. The funders there get actually into the detail of the cases and instruct the lawyers and are involved in decision making. Here we have to be a little bit careful. We're tolerated rather than accepted, although that changes. And by that I don't mean on a personality basis, I mean by way of actual legalities, in that we're not allowed to interfere in most common law jurisdictions. In the US, obviously, with a state-by-state view of the world, some states are more accepting of litigation finance than others, but generally the move has been towards acceptance. If you look what's happened in Singapore and Hong Kong, the move is towards acceptance of litigation finance generally. There may be jurisdictions that stay against it, but those that want to promote their court service, whether it be the Singapore courts versus the Hong Kong courts versus trying to dislodge London as the trial capital of the world or whatever, the move is to embrace litigation finance, because bringing big ticket commercial litigation and arbitration is expensive, and people don't want to pay legal fees of millions of dollars each month, and we have very deep pockets and we do want to pay those fees. So I think that's the way it's going.
Who's the shareholders in all of these?
Well, if you take Burford, which is the biggest, it's a public company, it's worth $3 billion or just over, and its shareholding ranges from individual members of the public to large institutions. So I think that's a really interesting point, actually, and I think there is a move towards public ownership and transparency and regulation, which is probably where we're going next, I guess, because I've been down this road before.
And lawyer?
Go on.
My follow-up question would actually be, how do you reconcile what you say should be transparent versus should be confidential? I mean, Sam, in theory, perhaps in practice, at a certain point you need to make prospectuses and explain to people, the potential investors, the product, and perhaps the litigants are not so keen to have everything published. I mean, how do you deal with that?
They
regulated.
Yes, but they can. This already exists. There's in the US, secondary investment in litigation, package litigation funding is already offered, and they're funded as a selection of cases of a particular type with a particular risk profile. So names and details are not published, but the nature of the case, you know, whether it's an IP case, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in America, whether it's a contract case, those sorts of things are published.
And this is, I mean, I don't want to be, I'm very much in favor of litigation funding, but I'm sometimes, you know, asking myself critical questions. And, but I mean, nonetheless, if you're saying, you know, we're packaging a bunch of claims, 100,000 of claims against Pfizer, would be a big case. Of course, all the small claimants are blackened out. But what do you do with the fact that and Pfizer has also a right to confidentiality, at least in Switzerland, if they would have. So
yes, well, if it's a class action against a major corporate, then it would be described as a class action against a major corporate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be it. But what I mean, there will be those, and there are those, and actually most of the class actions that attract funding are competition cases. And of course those are very public anyway.
Yeah.
But so there might be less confidentiality issues there. But a lot of them will be against one claimant against one defendant for a commercial claim, for example.
Can I say, are these products, are they subject to the securities laws, you know? Do they have the disclosure and registration requirements?
Well, litigation funding on a one-to-one basis, the primary market, I don't think is, because it's not lending, it's non-recourse, and we're funded in America where there's been no issue about it, and it's also large sums. So you're talking about above whatever the limits are for consumer regulation.
But with this new product,
there will be regulatory issues. Yes.
Yeah, we're having to get regulators a peer-to-peer crowdfunding platform in the UK, and so we're in discussions with the FCA at the moment about that. The actual products, we're offering a number of different products, and it goes back to your point, which was a very good one. In single case funding, and I know Lexjos do this, before you have any information, it's all anonymized until you sign an NDA, a digital executed NDA, and then you can access the case documents. But they're all on public record anyway.
But in this platform, when they regulate in the UK jurisdiction, if you're funding something in different jurisdiction, how this will apply if there is dispute?
Well, currently funding isn't regulated. The investment will be regulated from the source of, I mean, I'm guessing, and obviously Sam can speak for himself, but if you're taking investment in the UK, then you'll be regulated here in terms of how you take the cash. Litigation finance, isn't regulated. In the UK, it's self-regulated. There's a move, and it was the point I was going to allude to earlier. In Australia, where this all started, or became more of an industry than it was anywhere else in the world, there's currently a review going on, a commission's been set up to look at regulating litigation finance itself. And there were some recent class action decisions that were based on really the size of the balance sheet of the funder. And there's very much a move in Australia to transparency and capital adequacy, which is clearly important to make sure that you can fund the case from start to finish. And I think what you'll see is a move to transparency in terms of the funders and how they raise the money and how much they've got. And that's a slightly different question as opposed to regulating where the investment comes from. But the point I'm making is that as long as the funder shows how much money they have and that they can commit and then deliver on the execution that they've said they're going to do, and they abide by certain rules which would be set in terms of the transparency, how they operate, getting in and getting out of contracts, because clearly that's also important, very much similar to what we have in the UK, then I think a lot of the questions that I think you've raised would then be answered. But at the moment, the funding is not regulated, the investment process is.
I think the other point you were perhaps driving at is that in terms of, without giving away too much, there are not many jurisdictions where in practice you cannot fund. So there are different ways in which one can create a product that has the same outcome as funding or a similar outcome as funding, but works under the local law, or create a slightly different product which has similar outcomes but isn't funding, or indeed work with people in a different jurisdiction to create a funding that is perfectly legitimate in another jurisdiction in order to achieve the outcomes you're trying to get. So there aren't in practice that many places where one can't do it. And I think we were talking earlier about Ireland, where whilst the funding itself is not permitted, there are all sorts of things that people have been doing in Ireland that look very similar to funding.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a decision in, I think it was in Australia or in Singapore, which raised and answered the evergreen question whether litigation funding is not actually a sort of insurance business? And I remember that there is a decision out saying, I think it was Australia saying, well, sorry, you didn't have the insurance license, you're not allowed to take in that money, you can pay your
I think that was in relation to cost indemnities. So what a lot of funders do is in the UK they probably buy a legal expenses ATE policy, but obviously in certain jurisdictions the market for that is more challenging. So if there's a cost shifting regime, for example in Australia, which is I think the one you're referring to, a funder has to be very careful about giving a cost indemnity as to whether it's quasi-insurance, and if you're not an insurer that's regulated and you're giving insurance, then that, in the UK, that'd probably be a criminal offence as well as some sort of civil issue. So I think that's the decision that you're referring to. So what a funder might do is say, if you lose your case, I'll pay the legal fees of $1 million or whatever it is, but if you win your case, I want you to pay me $5 million. And that would be the way. So if they're on a no-win, no-fee, or they don't need the funding, but they do need a cost indemnity in case they lose, a funder might pick up the downside.
Oh, I see, that's the difference.
Yeah, and so by offering a cost indemnity, they're potentially offering an insurance policy against a particular outcome, and that might be in certain situations, depending on the wording and how it's dealt with, be deemed to be insurance, which unless you're an insurer you can't do.
There is here a secondary market, another secondary market, which is the secondary market in advising on the legality of funded arrangements. So if one is dealing with something reasonably substantial as a lawyer, turning to that secondary market to pick up some insurance through getting advice confirming that your arrangements are absolutely fine is probably worth doing.
There's a gentleman over here who's stood up 4 times. Sorry, we're expecting a really excellent question. Otherwise you're going to be thrown out.
To disappoint you, you see it's a fairly heavily debated issue already, and it seems to be fairly new, but actually, to my perspective, from my experience, it's not that new actually. The technology might be very new. But if you look back to what happened with sovereign debts 20 years ago, and Brady Net, and what it was sold off, and all the hedge funds playing in it, actually, when you had that technology at that moment, yeah, well, we wouldn't be sitting here right now.
I was
And
probably
you
still
see
on papers
also
back then.
the big difference between the common law systems, US, Great Britain, and the continental systems. You see from where the questions are from the technical point of view. It's from the European side where we don't really know that sort of we don't have that litigation funding. And indeed, you had in Britain several companies who had their own regulations, not officially, but you see the need in legislating all that, putting it in whatever statute law. You have already the expertise and insurance company, certainly export insurance companies. You see a much bigger movement about that in Great Britain and US, and actually, and it's amazing to see, we on the continent are absolutely ignorant about it.
We're gonna get your seat up here actually as well. So.
Can I just answer that? I would say that might be true in a lot of areas, but particularly in solvency and certainly in competition follow-on damages claims, the continent is very sophisticated to the point where you're creating companies to bring in and to assign the benefit of cases or pieces of litigation in those into those companies, and the antitrust competition space in Germany and the Netherlands is very advanced in terms of litigation finance. But I take it in relation to other areas, and that's probably, I think, historically due to the fact that legal fees have been slightly lower and the damages have been slightly lower, so it's not been quite such a fertile ground for big ticket, very expensive litigation, which is obviously what most single case funders are looking for.
But 2 years ago, if you'd been in a forum like this with a number of English lawyers, they'd have been in exactly the same position you're in now 2 or 3 years ago. So I think that everything we're seeing is that it's here, it's coming, it's global. There are people, I mean, there are one or two Dutch individuals certainly who are involved very heavily in the litigation sector, the litigation funding sector. Perhaps not necessarily Dutch companies, but it's coming.
Yeah, I know the Dutch companies. But from a trading point of view, if you're really talking about trading forum, there are indeed a lot of opportunities. Like the head of the legal department of the Indian company, sorry, I cannot pronounce his name. Yes. Well, he said there would be a great issue is litigating in the Middle East. Well, with this, I see a lot of opportunities, but that's...
Well, I'm just going to touch on that. Middle East is probably the hottest area in litigation finance in the world at the moment, just because of the cash flow issues and primarily arbitration, but the construction sector, and that's only going to get worse. I mean,
or better,
depending on your point of view. I mean, yes, there are challenges if you're litigating outside the DIFC in Dubai, for example, but certainly from my perspective, and I know from Clyde & Co.'s perspective, they see that as an area which is only going to grow and grow.
Fully agree.
Okay.
From the ground up.
Thank you. Is there any other final questions? Cal? Okay, we'll hear, guys, thanks to everyone at the panel here this afternoon, and we'll leave it there.